Prince Klemens Wenzel von Metternich was a politician and statesman of Rhenish extraction and one of the most important diplomats of his era, serving as the Austrian Empire's foreign minister from 1809 and chancellor from 1821 until the liberal revolutions of 1848 forced his resignation. One of his first tasks was to engineer a dark copyright tent with France that included the marriage of Napoleon to the Austrian archduchess Marie Louise. Soon after, he engineered Austria's entry into the War of the Sixth Coalition on the Allied side, signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau that sent Napoleon into exile, and led the Austrian delegation at the Congress of Vienna that divided post-Napoleonic Europe amongst the major powers. For his service to the Austrian Empire he was given the title of Prince in October 1813. Under his guidance, the Metternich system of international congresses continued for another decade as Austria aligned herself with Russia and, to a lesser extent, Prussia. This marked the high point of Austria's diplomatic importance, and thereafter Metternich slowly slipped into the periphery of international diplomacy. At home, Metternich held the post of Chancellor of State from 1821 until 1848, under both Francis I and his son Ferdinand I after brief exile in London, Brighton, and Brussels that lasted until 1851, he returned to the Viennese court, this time to offer only advice to Ferdinand's successor, Franz Josef. Having outlived his generation of politicians, Metternich died at the age of 86 in 1859. Born into the House of Metternich in 1773, the son of a diplomat, he was named after his godfather, Clement Wenceslas, Archbishop of Trier. Metternich received a good education at the universities of Strasbourg and Mainz. He was of help during the coronation of Francis II in 1792 and that of his predecessor, Leopold II, in 1790. After a brief trip to England, Metternich was named as the Austrian ambassador to the Netherlands, a short-lived post, since the country was brought under French control the next year. He married his first wife, Eleanor von Kaunitz, in 1795, which aided his entry into Viennese society. Despite having numerous affairs, he was devastated by her death in 1825. He would later remarry, wedding Baroness Antoinette Lacoum in 1827 and, after her death in 1829, Countess Melanie Zichy Ferraris in 1831. She would predecease him by 5 years. Before taking office as foreign minister, Metternich held numerous smaller posts, including ambassadorial roles in the Kingdom of Saxony, the Kingdom of Prussia and Napoleonic France. One of Metternich's sons, Richard von Metternich, was also a successful diplomat. Many of Metternich's 12 other acknowledged children predeceased him. A traditional conservative, Metternich was keen to maintain the balance of power, in particular by resisting Russian territorial ambitions in Central Europe and lands belonging to the Ottoman Empire. He disliked liberalism and worked to prevent the breakup of the Austrian Empire, for example, by crashing nationalist revolts in Austrian North Italy and the German states. At home, he pursued a similar policy, using censorship and a wide-ranging spy network to suppress unrest. Metternich has been both praised and heavily criticized for the policies he pursued. His supporters point out that he presided over the age of Metternich, when international diplomacy helped prevent major wars in Europe. His qualities as a diplomat are commended, some noting that his achievements were considerable in light of the weakness of his negotiating position. His decision to oppose Russian imperialism is seen as a good one. His detractors describe him as a boor who stuck to ill-thought-out, conservative principles out of vanity and a sense of infallibility. They argue he could have done much to secure Austria's future. Instead, his 1817 proposals for administrative reform were largely rejected, and his opposition to German nationalism is blamed for Germany's unification under Prussia and not Austria. Other historians have argued that he had far less power than this view suggests and that his policies were only exercised when they were in accord with the views of Austria's Habsburg monarchy. Early life. Klemens Metternich was born into the House of Metternich on May 15, 1773 to Franz Georg Karl Count Metternich Winberg zu Bielstein, a diplomat who had passed from the service of the Archbishopric of Trier to that of the imperial court, and his wife Countess Maria Beatrice Aloysia von Kagenegg. He was named in honor of Prince Klemens Wenceslaus of Saxony, the Archbishop-Elector of Trier and the past employer of his father. He was the eldest son and had one older sister. At the time of his birth the family possessed a ruined keep at Bielstein, a castle at Wynberg, an estate west of Koblenz, and another in Karl-Paragraph-Nixwort, Bohemia, one during the 17th century. At this time Metternich's father, described as a boring babbler and chronic liar by a contemporary, was the Austrian ambassador to the courts of the three Rhenish electors. Metternich's education was handled by his mother, heavily influenced by their proximity to France. For many years Metternich considered himself able to communicate better in French than German. As a child he went on official visits with his father and, under the direction of Protestant tutor John Frederick Simon, was tutored in academic subjects, swimming, and horsemanship. In the summer of 1788 Metternich began studying law at the University of Strasbourg, matriculating on November 12. While a student he was for some time accommodated by Prince Maximilian of Zweibrücken CKEN, the future King of Bavaria. At this time he was described by Simon as happy, handsome and lovable, though contemporaries would later recount how he had been a liar and a braggart. Metternich left Strasbourg in September 1790 to attend Leopold II's October coronation in Frankfurt, where he performed the largely honorific role of ceremonial marshal to the Catholic bench of the College of the Counts of Westphalia. There, under the wing of his father, he met with the future Francis II and looked at ease among the attendant nobility. Between the end of 1790 and summer of 1792 Metternich studied law at the University of Mainz, receiving a more conservative education than at Strasbourg, a city now too unsafe to which to return. In the summers he worked with his father, who had been appointed plenipotentiary to the Austrian Netherlands. In March 1792 Francis succeeded his father Leopold as Holy Roman Emperor and was crowned in July, affording Metternich a reprisal of his earlier role of ceremonial marshal. To this he added the honor of opening the accompanying ball alongside Louise of Mecklenburg. In the meantime France had declared war on Austria, beginning the War of the First Coalition and making Metternich's further study in Mainz impossible. Now in the employment of his father, he was sent on a special mission to the front. Here he came lead the interrogation of the French Minister of War the Marquis de Beer-Nonville and several National Convention accompanying commissioners. Metternich observed the siege and fall of Valenciennes, later looking back on these as substantial lessons about warfare. In early 1794 he was sent to England ostensibly on official business helping Viscount de Zandrelin, the Treasurer-General of the Austrian Netherlands, to negotiate a loan. Marriage and the Congress of Rastatt. In England he met the King on several occasions and dined with a number of influential British politicians, including William Pitt, Charles James Fox and Edmund Burke. Metternich was nominated the new minister plenipotentiary to the Austrian Netherlands and left England in September 1794. Unfortunately, he found an exiled and powerless government in headlong retreat from the latest French advance. In October a revitalized French army swept into Germany and annexed all of the Metternich estates except Karl-Paragraph-Nixwort. Disappointed, and affected by strong criticism of his father's policies, he joined his parents in Vienna in November. On September 27, 1795 he married Countess Eleanor von Kaunitz, a granddaughter of former Austrian Chancellor Wenzel Kaunitz. The marriage was arranged by Metternich's mother and introduced him to Viennese society. This was undoubtedly part of the motivation for Metternich, who demonstrated less affection for her than she for him. Two conditions were imposed by the father of the bride, Prince Kaunitz. First, the still youthful Eleanor was to continue to live at home. And second, Metternich was forbidden from serving as a diplomat as long as the prince was still alive. Their daughter Maria was born in January 1797. After Metternich's studies in Vienna, the prince's death in September 1797 allowed Metternich to participate in the Congress of Rastatt. Initially his father took him as a secretary while ensuring that, when proceedings officially started in December 1797, he was named the representative of the Catholic bench of the College of the Counts of Westphalia. Aboard Metternich remained at Rastatt in this role until 1799 when the Congress was finally wound down. During this period Eleanor had chosen to live with Metternich at Rastatt and gave birth to sons Francis and, shortly after the end of the Congress, Klemens. Much to Metternich's anguish, Klemens died after only a few days, and Francis soon contracted a lung infection from which he would never recover. Ambassador Dresden and Berlin The Holy Roman Empire's defeat in the War of the Second Coalition shook up diplomatic circles, and the promising Metternich was now offered a choice between three ministerial positions: to the Imperial Diet at Regensburg, to the Kingdom of Denmark at Copenhagen, or to the Elector of Saxony at Dresden. He chose Dresden in late January 1801, and his appointment was officially announced in February. Metternich summoned in Vienna, where he wrote his instructions, a memorandum showing much greater understanding of statesmanship than his earlier writing. He visited the Car-Paragraph Nixwit estate in the autumn before taking up his new position on November 4. The subtleties of the memorandum were lost on the Saxon court, which was headed by the retiring Frederick Augustus, a man with little political initiative. Despite the boredom of the court, Metternich enjoyed the light-hearted frivolity of the city and took up a mistress, Katharina Bagration, who bore him a daughter, Clementine. In January 1803 Metternich and his wife had a child whom they named Victor. In Dresden Metternich also made a number of important contacts, including Friedrich Jentz, a publicist who would serve Metternich as both confidant and critic for the next 30 years. He also established links with important Polish and French political figures. The imperial recess of 1803 brought Metternich's family new estates in Ochsenhausen, the title of prince, and a seat in the imperial diet. In the ensuing diplomatic reshuffle Metternich was appointed ambassador to the Kingdom of Prussia, being notified of this in February 1803 and taking his position in November of that year. He arrived at a critical juncture in European diplomacy, soon growing worried about the territorial ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte, newly the leader of France. This fear was shared by the Russian court under Alexander I, and the Tsar kept Metternich informed of Russian policy. By autumn of 1804 Vienna decided on action entered into in August 1805 when the Austrian Empire began its involvement in the War of the Third Coalition. Metternich's now almost impossible task was to convince Prussia to join the coalition against Bonaparte. Their eventual agreement was not due to Metternich, however, and after the coalition's defeat at the Battle of Austerlitz, Prussia disregarded the agreement and signed a treaty with the French instead. Paris In the ensuing reshuffle in Vienna Johann Philipp Stadion became the Austrian foreign minister, freeing Metternich to assume the post of ambassador to the Russian Empire. He never made it to Russia, as need had arisen for a new Austrian at the French court. Metternich was approved for the post in June 1806. He enjoyed being in demand and was happy to be sent to France on a generous salary of 90,000 gulden a year. After an arduous trip he took up residence in August 1806, being briefed by Baron von Vincent and Engelbert von Floret, whom he would retain as a close advisor for 2 decades. He met French Foreign Minister Charles Talleyrand on August 5 and Napoleon himself 5 days later at St. Cloud. Soon, the War of the Fourth Coalition drew both Talleyrand and Napoleon eastwards. Metternich's wife and children joined him in October, and he went into society, using his charm to win great eminence there. The presence of Eleanor did not prevent him from a series of affairs that certainly included Napoleon's sister Caroline Murat, La Junot, and perhaps many besides. After the treaties of Tilsit of July 1807 Metternich saw that Austria's position in Europe was much more vulnerable but believed the accord between Russia and France would not last. In the meantime he found the new French foreign minister, Jean-Baptiste Campani, unaccommodating and struggled to negotiate a satisfactory settlement over the future of several French forts on the River Inn. Over the following months the reach of Austrian policy, and Metternich's own reputation, increased. Metternich pushed for a Russo-Austrian alliance, though Tsar Alexander was too preoccupied with the 3 other wars he was engaged in to commit. Over time, Metternich came to see an eventual war with France as inevitable. In a memorable event, Metternich argued with Napoleon at Napoleon's 39th birthday celebrations in August 1808 over the increasingly obvious preparations for war on both sides. Soon after, Napoleon refused Metternich's attendance at the Congress of Erfurt. Metternich was later glad to hear from Talleyrand that Napoleon's attempts at the Congress to get Russia to invade Austria had proved unsuccessful. In late 1808 Metternich was recalled to Vienna for 5 weeks of meetings about the possibility of Austria invading France while Napoleon was on campaign in Spain. His memoranda reported that France was not united behind Napoleon, that Russia was unlikely to want to fight Austria, and that France had few reliable troops that could fight in Central Europe. Back in Paris, Metternich was overtly apprehensive about his own safety. When Austria declared war on France, Metternich was indeed arrested in retaliation for the arrest of 2 French diplomats in Vienna, but the effects of this were minimal. He was allowed to leave France under escort for Austria in late May 1809. After Napoleon's capture of Vienna, Metternich was conducted to the Austrian capital and exchanged there for the French diplomats. Foreign Minister Copyright Tent with France Now back in Austria, Metternich witnessed firsthand the Austrian army's defeat at the Battle of Wagram. Stadion tendered his resignation as foreign minister in the aftermath, and the emperor immediately offered the post to Metternich. Metternich, worried that Napoleon would seize on this to demand harsher peace terms, instead agreed to become a minister of state and to lead negotiations with the French on the understanding that he would replace Stadion as foreign minister at a later date. During peace talks at Altenburg, Metternich put forward pro-French proposals to save the Austrian monarchy. Napoleon, however, disliked his position on the future of Poland, and Metternich was gradually displaced from the proceedings by Prince Liechtenstein. He soon regained influence, however, on October 8, as foreign minister. In early 1810 Metternich's earlier affair with Junod became public but, because of Eleanor's understanding, the scandal was minimal. One of Metternich's first tasks was to push for the marriage of Napoleon to Archduchess Marie Louise rather than to the Tsar's youngest sister Anna Pavlovna. Metternich would later seek to distance himself from the marriage by claiming it was Napoleon's own idea, but this is improbable. In any case, he was happy to claim responsibility at the time. By February 7 Napoleon had agreed and the pair were married by proxy on March 11. Marie Louise left for France soon after and Metternich followed by a different route and unofficially. The trip was designed, Metternich explained, to transport his family home and to report to the Austrian Emperor about Marie Louise's activities. Instead, Metternich stayed 6 months, entrusting his office in Vienna to his father. He set about using the marriage, and flattery, to renegotiate the terms set out at paragraph NBAUNN. The concessions he won were trivial, however, a few trading rights, delay in the payment of the war indemnity, restitution of some estates belonging to Germans in the Austrian service, including the Metternich families, and the lifting of a 150,000-man limit on the Austrian army. The last was particularly welcomed as a sign of increased Austrian independence, although Austria could no longer afford an army greater than the limit prescribed. As France's ally, when Metternich returned to Vienna in October 1810, he was no longer as popular. His influence was limited to foreign affairs, and his attempts to get a full Council of State reintroduced had failed. Convinced that a much weakened Austria should avoid another invasion by France, he rejected the advances of Tsar Alexander and instead concluded an alliance with Napoleon on March 14, 1812. He also supported a period of moderate censorship, aimed at preventing provocation of the French. Requiring that only 30,000 Austrian troops fight alongside the French, the alliance treaty was more generous than the one Prussia had signed a month earlier. This allowed Metternich to give both Britain and Russia assurances that Austria remained committed to curbing Napoleonic ambitions. He accompanied his sovereign for a final meeting with Napoleon at Dresden in May 1812 before the French invasion of Russia. The Dresden meeting revealed that Austria's influence in Europe had reached its lowest point, and Metternich was now bent on re-establishing that influence by using what he considered strong ties with all sides in the war, proposing general peace talks headed by Austria. Over the next 3 months, he would slowly distance Austria from the French cause, while avoiding alliance with either Prussia or Russia, and remaining open to any proposal that would secure a place for the combined Bonaparte-Habsburg dynasty. This was driven by concern that if Napoleon were defeated, Russia and Prussia would stand to gain too much. Napoleon was intransigent, however, and the fighting continued. Austria's alliance with France ended in February 1813, and Austria then moved to a position of armed neutrality. As a neutral, Metternich was much less keen on turning against France than many of his contemporaries, and he favored his own plans for a general settlement. In November 1813 he offered Napoleon the Frankfurt proposals, which would allow Napoleon to remain emperor but would reduce France to its natural frontiers, and undo its control of most of Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. Napoleon, expecting to win the war, delayed too long and lost this opportunity. By December the Allies had withdrawn the offer. By early 1814, as they were closing in on Paris, Napoleon agreed to the Frankfurt proposals too late, and he rejected the new, harsher terms then proposed. Nevertheless, the Allies were not faring well, and although a statement of general war aims that included many nods to Austria was secured from Russia, Britain remained distrustful and generally unwilling to give up the military initiative she had fought 20 years to establish. Despite this, Francis created the Austrian Foreign Minister Grand Chancellor of the Order of Maria Theresa, a post which had been vacant since the time of Kaunitz. Metternich increasingly worried that Napoleon's retreat would bring with it disorder that would harm the Habsburgs. A peace had to be concluded soon, he believed. Since Britain could not be coerced, he sent proposals to France and Russia only. These were rejected, though after the battles of La One-Courtauzen and Barton, a French-initiated truce was called. Starting in April Metternich began to slowly and reluctantly prepare Austria for war with France. The armistice provided Austria time for fuller complete mobilization. In June Metternich left Vienna to personally handle negotiations at Gitschin in Bohemia. When he arrived he benefited from the hospitality of Princess Wilhelmine, Duchess of Sagan, and began an affair with her that lasted several months. No other mistress ever achieved such influence over Metternich as Wilhelmine, and he would continue to write to her after their separation. Meanwhile, French Foreign Minister Hugues Bernard Marat remained elusive, though Metternich did manage to discuss the state of affairs with the Tsar on June 19 at Opuchna. In talks which would later be ratified as the Reichenbach Convention, they agreed on general peace demands and set out a process by which Austria could enter the war on the coalition side. Shortly afterwards Metternich was invited to join Napoleon at Dresden, where he could put the terms directly. Though no reliable record of their meeting on June 26, 1813 exists, it seems it was a stormy but effective meeting. Agreement was finally reached as Metternich was about to leave. Peace talks would start in Prague in July and run until August 20. In agreeing to this Metternich had ignored the Reichenbach Convention, and this angered Austria's coalition allies. The Conference of Prague would never properly meet, since Napoleon gave his representatives Armand Caulaincourt an account of Narbonne insufficient powers to negotiate. At the informal discussions held anew of the conference, Caulaincourt implied that Napoleon would not negotiate until an Allied army threatened France itself. This convinced Metternich, and, after an ultimatum Metternich issued to France went unheeded, Austria declared war on August 12. As a coalition partner, Austria's allies saw the declaration as an admission that Austria's diplomatic ambitions had failed, but Metternich viewed it as one move in a much longer campaign. For the rest of the war he strove to hold the coalition together and, as such, to curb Russia's momentum in Europe. To this end he won an early victory as an Austrian general. The Prince of Schwarzenberg was confirmed supreme commander of the coalition forces rather than Tsar Alexander I. He also succeeded in getting the three Allied monarchs to follow him and their armies on campaign. With the treaties of Teplitz, Metternich allowed Austria to remain uncommitted over the future of France, Italy, and Poland. He was still confined, however, by the British, who were subsidizing Prussia and Russia. Meanwhile, the coalition forces took the offensive. On October 18, 1813 Metternich witnessed the successful Battle of Leipzig and, 2 days later, he was rewarded for his wise direction with the rank of Prince. Metternich was delighted when Frankfurt was retaken in early November and, in particular, by the deference the Tsar showed Francis at a ceremony organized there by Metternich. Diplomatically, with the war drawing to a close, he remained determined to prevent the creation of a strong, unified German state, even offering Napoleon generous terms in order to retain him as a counterweight. On December 2, 1813, Napoleon agreed to talk, though these talks were delayed by the need for the participation of a more senior British diplomat. Before talks could begin, coalition armies crossed the Rhine on December 22. Metternich retired from Frankfurt to Breslau to celebrate Christmas with his wife's family before travelling to the new coalition headquarters at Basel in January 1814. Quarrels with Tsar Alexander, particularly over the fate of France, intensified in January, prompting Alexander to storm out. He therefore missed the arrival of Castlereagh in mid-January. Metternich and Castlereagh formed a good working relationship and then met with Alexander at Langres. The Tsar remained unaccommodating, however, demanding a push into the centre of France. Fortunately, he was too preoccupied to object to Metternich's other ideas, like a final peace conference in Vienna. Metternich did not attend talks with the French at Châtillon, as he wanted to stay with Alexander. The talks stalled, and, after a brief advance, coalition forces had to retreat after the Montmirail and Montereau. This relieved Metternich's fears that an overconfident Alexander might act unilaterally. Metternich continued negotiations with the French envoy Caulaincourt through early to mid-March 1814, when victory at the Lane put the coalition back on the offensive. By this time Metternich was tiring of trying to hold the coalition together, and even the British engineer Treaty of Fontainebleau did not help. In the absence of the Prussians and Russians, the coalition agreed to the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty. Francis rejected a final plea from Napoleon that he abdicate in favour of his wife, and Paris fell on March 30. Military manoeuvres had forced Metternich westward to Dijon on March 24, and now, after deliberate delay, he left for the French capital on April 7. On April 10 he found the city at peace and, much to his annoyance, largely in the control of Tsar Alexander. The Austrians disliked the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau that Russia had imposed on Napoleon in their absence, but Metternich was reluctant to oppose them and on April 11 signed the treaty. Thereafter he focused on safeguarding Austrian interests in the forthcoming peace, asserting Austria's influence in Germany over that of Prussia, and undoing Russian ascendancy. For these reasons he ensured that the Italian provinces of Lombardy and Venetia, lost to French client states in 1805, were duly re-annexed. On the division of formerly French-occupied Poland and Germany, Metternich was more confined by the interests of the Allies. After two failed proposals, advanced by the Prussians, the issue was postponed until after a peace treaty had been signed. Elsewhere, Metternich, like many of his counterparts, was anxious to provide the renewed French monarchy with the resources to suppress new revolution. The generous Treaty of Paris was signed on May 30. Now free, Metternich accompanied Tsar Alexander to England. Wilhelmine, who had followed Metternich to Paris, also made the crossing. A triumphant Metternich filled his 4 weeks with revelry, re-establishing his reputation and that of Austria. He was also awarded an honorary law degree from the University of Oxford. By contrast and to Metternich's pleasure, Alexander was ill-mannered and often insulting. Despite the opportunities, little diplomacy took place. Instead, all that was firmly agreed was that proper discussions would take place at Vienna, with a date tentatively set for August 15. When the Tsar tried to postpone it to October, Metternich agreed but effected conditions that prevented Alexander from exercising any advantage due to his de facto control of Poland. Metternich was eventually reunited with his family in Austria in the middle of July 1814, having stopped for a week in France to soothe fears surrounding Napoleon's wife Marie Louise, now the Duchess of Parma. His return to Vienna was celebrated by an occasional cantata that included the line "History holds thee up to posterity as a model among great men." Congress of Vienna. In the autumn of 1814 the heads of the 5 reigning dynasties and representatives from 216 noble families began gathering Vienna. Before ministers from the Big Four arrived, Metternich stayed quietly in Baden-Baden, 2 hours to the south. When he heard they had reached Vienna he journeyed to meet them and encouraged them to go with him back to Baden. they declined, and 4 meetings were held in the city itself. In these, the representatives agreed on how the Congress would operate and, to Metternich's delight, named his own aide Friedrich Jens secretary to the negotiations of the Big Six. When Talleyrand and Spanish representative Don Pedro Labrador learned of these decisions, they were incensed that agreements were negotiated by the Big Four only. Sweden and Portugal were similarly angered by their exclusion from all but the full Congress, especially since Metternich was determined to give the latter as little power as possible. As a result, the Big Six became the preliminary committee of the Eight, whose first decision was that the Congress itself be postponed to November 1. In fact, it would soon be postponed again, with only a minor commission beginning work in November. In the meantime, Metternich organized a controversially vast array of entertainments for the delegates including himself. Leaving Castlereagh to negotiate on Tsar Alexander's behalf, Metternich briefly turned his attention to quelling anti-Habsburg feeling in Italy. Around the same time, he learned that the Duchess of Sagan was courting the Tsar. Disappointed, and exhausted by social rounds, Metternich let his guard drop, angering Tsar Alexander during negotiations over Poland by implying Austria could match Russia militarily. The pair would never meet in person again. Despite the blunder, Francis refused to dismiss his foreign minister, and political crisis rocked Vienna throughout November, culminating in a declaration by Tsar Alexander that Russia would not compromise in her claim on Poland as a satellite kingdom. The coalition rejected this utterly, and agreement seemed further off than ever. During the standoff, it seems that Alexander even went as far as to challenge Metternich to a duel. Fortunately for Metternich, Tsar Alexander soon did a rapid volte-face and agreed to the division of Poland. He also softened in regard to the Germanic kingdom of Saxony, and for the first time allowed Talleyrand to participate in all Big Four discussions. With the new consensus, the major issues concerning Poland and Germany were settled in the second week of February 1815. Austria gained land in the partition of Poland and prevented the Prussian annexation of Saxony, but was forced to accept Russian dominance in Poland and increasing Prussian influence in Germany. Metternich now focused on getting the various German states to cede historic rights to a new federal diet that could stand up to Prussia. He also assisted the Swiss Committee and worked on a myriad of smaller issues, like navigation rights on the Rhine. The beginning of Lent on February 8 brought him more time to devote to these congressional issues as well as private discussions about southern Italy, where Joachim Murat was said to be raising a Neapolitan army. On March 7 Metternich was awakened with the news that Napoleon had escaped from his island prison of Elba and within an hour had met with both the Tsar and the King of Prussia. Metternich wanted no rash change of course, and at first there was little impact on the Congress. Finally, on March 13 the Big Five declared Napoleon an outlaw and the Allies began preparations for renewed fighting. On March 25 they signed a treaty committing each to sending 150,000 men with little sign of their prior divisive stances. After the military commanders left, the Vienna Congress settled down to serious work, fixing the boundaries of an independent Netherlands, formalizing proposals for a loose confederation of Swiss cantons, and ratifying earlier agreements over Poland. By late April only 2 major issues remained, the organization of a new German federation and the problem of Italy. The latter soon began to come to a head. Austria had solidified its control over Lombardy, Venice and extended its protection to provinces nominally under the control of France's daughter Marie Louise. On April 18 Metternich announced that Austria was formally at war with Murat's Naples. Austria won the Battle of Tolentino on May 3 and captured Naples less than 3 weeks later. Metternich then was able to delay a decision on the future of the country until after Vienna. Discussions about Germany would drag on until early June, when a joint Austrian-Prussian proposition was ratified. It left most constitutional issues to the new Diet. Its president would be the Emperor Francis himself. Despite criticism from within Austria, Metternich was pleased with the outcome and the degree of control it granted Habsburgs, and, through them, himself. Certainly, Metternich was able to use the Diet to his own ends on numerous occasions. The arrangement was similarly popular with most German representatives. A summation treaty was signed on June 19, bringing the Vienna Congress officially to an end. Metternich himself had left on June 13 for the front line, prepared for a lengthy war against Napoleon. Napoleon, however, was defeated decisively at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18. Paris and Italy. On June 15, 1815, Metternich was with coalition allies in Paris, once more discussing peace terms, when he read that his son and two daughters had narrowly escaped death after a bridge collapsed. He disliked the enforced separation. After 133 days of negotiations, longer than the turmoil itself, the Second Treaty of Paris was concluded on November 20. Metternich, of the opinion that France should not be dismembered, was happy with the result. France lost only a little land along its eastern borders, 700 million French francs, and the artworks it had plundered. It also accepted an army of occupation numbering 150,000. In the meantime, a separate treaty, proposed by Alexander and redrafted by Metternich, had been signed on September 26. This created a new Holy Alliance centered on Russia, Prussia and Austria. It was a document Metternich neither pushed for nor wanted, given its vaguely liberal sentiments. Representatives from most of the European states eventually signed, with the exception of the Pope, the United Kingdom, and the Ottoman Empire. Shortly afterwards, a separate treaty reaffirmed the Quadruple Alliance and established through its sixth article the Congress system of regular diplomatic meetings. With Europe at peace, the Austrian flag now flew over 50% more land than when Metternich had become foreign minister. Metternich now returned to the question of Italy, making his first visit to the country in early December 1815. After visiting Venice, his family joined him in Milan on December 18. For once it was Metternich playing the liberal, vainly urging Francis to give the region some autonomy. Metternich spent 4 months in Italy, endlessly busy and suffering chronic inflammation of the eyelids. He tried to control Austrian foreign policy from Milan and, when there was a serious disagreement between the Empire and the Kingdom of Bavaria, was heavily criticized for his absence. His enemies could not capitalize on this, however. Stadion was occupied by his work as finance minister, and the Empress Maria Ludovica, a fierce critic of Metternich's policies, died in April. The uncharacteristic gap between the views of Metternich and his emperor was eased only by active compromise of proposals. Metternich returned to Vienna on May 28, 1816 after almost a year's absence. Professionally, the rest of 1816 passed quietly for the tired minister, who was concerned with fiscal policy and monitoring the spread of liberalism in Germany and nationalism in Italy. Personally, he was shaken in November by the death of Giuseppe Festetics. 2 years later he wrote that his life ended there, and his old frivolity took some time to return. The only consolation was July's news that Metternich was to receive new estates along the Rhine at Johannesburg, only 25 miles from his birthplace at Koblenz. In June 1817 Metternich was required to escort the emperor's newlywed daughter Maria Leopoldina to a ship at Livorno. There was delay upon their arrival, and Metternich spent the time travelling around Italy again. He visited Venice, Padua, Ferrara, Pisa, Florence and Lucca. Though alarmed by developments, he was optimistic and made another plea for decentralization on August 29. After this failed, Metternich decided to broaden his efforts into general administrative reform to avoid the appearance of favoring the Italians over the rest of the empire. While working on this, he returned to Vienna on September 12, 1817 to be immediately caught up in the organization his daughter Maria's marriage to Count Joseph Esterházy just 3 days later. It proved too much, and Metternich was taken ill. After a delay for recovery, Metternich condensed his proposals for Italy into 3 documents he submitted to Francis, all dated October 27, 1817. The administration would remain undemocratic, but there would be a new Ministry of Justice and 4 new Chancellors each with local remits, including one for Italy. Importantly, the divisions would be regional, not national. In the end, Francis accepted the revised proposals, albeit with several alterations and restrictions. Aachen, to Police, Karlsbad, Troppe and Leipzig Metternich's primary focus remained on preserving unity among the great powers of Europe and hence his own power as mediator. He was also concerned by liberal-minded Ioannis Kapodistria's increasing influence over Tsar Alexander and the continual threat of Russia annexing large areas of the declining Ottoman Empire. As he had earlier envisaged, by April 1818 Britain had drawn up, and Metternich pushed through, proposals to have a congress at Aachen, then a Prussian frontier town, 6 months later. Meanwhile, Metternich was advised to go to the spa town of Carlsbad to treat the rheumatic tension in his back. It was a pleasant month-long trip, although it was there he received news of the death of his father at the age of 72. He visited the family estate at Nixfurt and then Frankfurt in late August to encourage the member states of the German Confederation to agree on procedural issues. He could also now visit Koblenz for the first time in 25 years and his new estate at Johannesburg. Traveling with Emperor Francis, he was warmly greeted by the Catholic towns along the Rhine as he progressed towards Aachen. He had arranged in advance for newspapers to cover the first peacetime congress of its kind. As discussions began, Metternich pushed for the withdrawal of Allied troops from France and means for preserving the unity of the European powers. The former was agreed almost immediately. But on the latter agreement extended only to maintaining the Quadruple Alliance. Metternich rejected the Tsar's idealistic plans for a single European army. His own recommendations to the Prussians for greater controls on freedom of speech was equally hard for other powers such as Britain to support openly. Metternich travelled with Dorothea Lieven to Brussels soon after the Congress broke up, and although he could not stay more than a few days, the pair exchanged letters for the next 8 years. He arrived in Vienna on December 11, 1818 and was finally able to spend considerable time with his children. He entertained the Tsar during the Christmas season and spent 12 weeks monitoring Italy and Germany before setting off with the Emperor on a third trip to Italy. The trip was cut short by the assassination of the conservative German dramatist August von Kotzebue. After a short delay, Metternich decided that if the German governments would not act against this perceived problem, Austria would have to compel them. He called an informal conference in Carlsbad and sounded out Prussian support beforehand by meeting with Frederick William III of Prussia in Teplice in July. Metternich carried the day, using a recent attempt on the life of the chief minister of Nassau, Karl Abel, to win agreement for the conservative program now known as the Convention of Teplitz. The Carlsbad Conference opened on August 6 and ran for the rest of the month. Metternich overcame any opposition to his proposed group of anti-revolutionary measures, correct and peremptory, although they were condemned by outsiders. Despite censure, Metternich was very pleased with the result, known as the Carlsbad Decrees. At the conference in Vienna later in the year, Metternich found himself constrained by the princes of Württemberg and Bavaria to abandon his plans to reform the German Federation. He now regretted having so quickly forced through its original constitution 5 years before. Nevertheless, he held ground on other issues and the conference's final act was highly reactionary, much as Metternich had envisaged it. He remained in Vienna until the close in May 1820, finding the whole affair a bore. On May 6 he heard of the death of his daughter Clementine tuberculosis. Journeying on to Prague, he heard that his eldest daughter Maria had also contracted the disease. He was at her bedside in Baden-Baden when she died on July 20. This prompted Eleanor and the remaining children to leave for the cleaner air of France. The rest of 1820 was filled with liberal revolts to which Metternich was expected to respond. Ultimately, the Austrian foreign minister was torn between following through on his conservative pledge and keeping out of a country in which Austria had no interest. He chose sympathetic inactivity on Spain but, much to his dismay and surprise, Guglielmo Pepe led a revolt in Naples in early July and forced King Ferdinand I to accept a new constitution. Metternich reluctantly agreed to attend the Russian-initiated Congress of Vienna in October to discuss these events. He need not have worried, the Tsar gave way and accepted the compromise proposal of a moderate interventionism. Still worried by Kapodistria's influence over the Tsar, he laid down his conservative principles in a long memorandum, including an attack the free press and the initiative of the middle classes. The Congress disbanded in the third week of December, and the next step would be a congress at Liège to discuss intervention with Ferdinand. Metternich found himself able to dominate Liège more than any other congress, overseeing Ferdinand's rejection of the liberal constitution he had agreed to only months before. Austrian armies left for Naples in February and entered the city in March. The Congress was adjourned but, forewarned or by luck, Metternich kept representatives of the powers close at hand until the revolt was put down. As a result, when similar revolts broke out in Piedmont in the middle of March, Metternich had the Tsar at hand, who agreed to send 90,000 men to the frontier in a show of solidarity. Concerns grew in Vienna that Metternich's policy was too expensive. He responded that Naples and Piedmont would pay for stability. Nonetheless, he, too, was clearly worried for the future of Italy. He was relieved when able to create a court chancellor and Chancellor of State on May 25, a post left vacant since the death of Kaunitz in 1794. He was also pleased at the renewed closeness between Austria, Prussia and Russia. However, it had come at the expense of the Anglo-Austrian Entente. Chancellor equals Hanover, Verona and Tronowitz equals, in 1821, while Metternich was still at Liège with Tsar Alexander, the revolt of Alexander Ypsilantis threatened to bring the Ottoman Empire to the brink of collapse. Wanting a strong Ottoman Empire to counterbalance Russian, Metternich opposed all forms of Greek nationalism. Before Alexander returned to Russia, Metternich secured his agreement not to act unilaterally and would write to the Tsar again and again asking him not to intervene. For extra support he met with Viscount Castlereagh and King George IV of the United Kingdom in Hanover in October. The warmness of Metternich's welcome was sweetened by his promise to settle in part Austria's financial debts to Britain. The earlier Anglo-Austrian Entente was thus restored, and the pair agreed that they would support the Austrian position concerning the Balkans. Metternich went away happy, not least because he had met Dorothea Lieven once more. Over Christmas the Tsar wavered more than Metternich had expected and sent Dmitry Tatishev to Vienna in February 1822 for talks with Metternich. Metternich soon convinced the conceited and ambitious Russian to let him dictate events. In return Austria promised to support Russia in enforcing her treaties with the Ottomans if the other alliance members would do likewise. Metternich was aware this was politically impossible for the British. Metternich's adversary at the Russian court, Kapodistrias, retired from service there. However, by the end of April there was a new threat, Russia now determined to intervene in Spain, action Metternich described as utter nonsense. He played for time, convincing his ally Castlereagh to come to Vienna for talks before a scheduled congress in Verona, although Castlereagh died by suicide on August 12. With Castlereagh dead and relations with the British weakening, Metternich had lost a useful ally. The Congress of Verona was a fine social event but diplomatically less successful. Supposedly concerned with Italy, the Congress had to focus on Spain instead. Austria urged non-intervention, but the French carried the day with their proposal for a joint invasion force. Prussia committed men, and the Tsar pledged 150,000. Metternich worried about the difficulties of transporting such numbers to Spain and about French ambitions, but still pledged support for the joint force. He lingered in Verona until December 18, then spending some days in Venice with the Tsar and then by himself in Munich. He returned to Vienna in early January 1823 and remained until September. After Verona he travelled much less than before, partly because of his new post as Chancellor and partly because of his declining health. He was buoyed by the arrival of his family from Paris in May. He shone once more in Viennese society. Politically, the year was one of disappointments. In March the French crossed the Pyrenees unilaterally, undoing the moral solidarity established at Verona. Likewise, Metternich thought the new Pope Leo XII too pro-French, and there was trouble between Austria and several German states over why they had not been included at Verona. Furthermore, Metternich, in discrediting the Russian diplomat Pozzo di Borgo, instead renewed the Tsar's former suspicion of him. Worse came in late September, while accompanying the emperor to a meeting with Alexander at Tronowitz, an Austrian settlement now in the Ukraine, Metternich fell ill with a fever. He could not continue and had to make do with brief talks with the Russian foreign minister, Karl Nesselrode. At the Tronowitz talks, in Metternich's absence, an impatient Tsar asked for a congress in the then Russian capital St. Petersburg to discuss the Eastern question. Metternich, wary of letting the Russians dominate affairs, could only play for time. Fortunately for Metternich, the Tsar's dual proposal for the St. Petersburg meetings, a settlement of the Eastern question favorable to Russia and limited autonomy for 3 Greek principalities, was a pairing unpalatable to the other European powers, and potential attendees like British Foreign Secretary George Canning slowly turned away, much to the annoyance of Alexander. Metternich believed for several months afterward that he had gained a unique level of influence over the Tsar. Meanwhile, he renewed the conservative program he had outlined at Carlsbad 5 years before and sought to further increase Austrian influence over the German Federal Diet. He also informed the press they could no longer publicize the minutes of Diet meetings, only its rulings. In January 1825 he began to worry about his wife Eleanor's health and he reached her sickbed in Paris shortly before her death on March 19. Mourning sincerely for her, he also took the opportunity to dine with the Paris elite. Unfortunately, an aside he made about the Tsar there was reported back and did not enhance his reputation. He left Paris for the last time on April 21 and was joined by the Emperor in Milan after arriving on May 7. He declined the Pope's invitation to become a cardinal of the Church. There was also a short trip to Genoa. Early in July the court dispersed and Metternich visited his daughters Lentine and Hermann in the quiet town of Bad Ischl. Despite the seclusion he received constant reports, including those of ominous developments in the Ottoman Empire, where the Greek revolt was rapidly being crushed by Ibrahim Ali of Egypt. He also had to deal with fallout from St. Petersburg where the Tsar, although unable to convene a full Congress, had talked with all the major ambassadors. By mid-May it was clear the Allies could not decide on a course of action and, as such, the Holy Alliance was no longer a viable political entity. Hungarian Diets, Alexander I's death, and problems in Italy equals. In the early 1820s, Metternich had advised Francis that convening the Hungarian Diet would help get approval for financial reform. In fact, the Diet of 1825–1827 saw 300 sessions filled with criticism of how the empire had eroded the historic rights of the Kingdom of Hungary's nobility. Metternich complained that it interfered with his time, his customs and his daily life, as he was forced to travel to Pressburg to perform ceremonial duties and to observe. He was alarmed by the growth of Hungarian national sentiment and wary of the growing influence of nationalist Istvo and Tsar copyright Shinai, whom he had met twice in 1825. Back in Vienna, in mid-December, he heard of the death of Tsar Alexander with mixed feelings. He had known the Tsar well and was reminded of his own frailty, although the death potentially wiped the sour diplomatic slate clean. Moreover, he could claim credit for foreseeing the Decembrist liberal revolt the new Tsar Nicholas I had to crush. Now 53, Metternich chose to send Archduke Ferdinand to establish first contact with Nicholas. Metternich was also friendly with the British envoy and enlisted his help to charm Nicholas. Despite this, the first 18 months of Nicholas' reign did not go well for Metternich. Firstly, the British were chosen over the Austrians to oversee Russian-Ottoman talks. And, as a result, Metternich could exercise no influence over the resulting Ackermann Convention. France too began to drift away from Metternich's non-interventionist position. In August 1826 Russian Foreign Minister Nesselrode rejected a proposal by Metternich to convene a congress to discuss the events that eventually led to the outbreak of civil war in Portugal. The Austrian foreign minister accepted this with surprising resilience. On November 5, 1827 Antoinette von Laeken became Metternich's second wife. She was only 20, and their marriage, a small affair at Hetzendorf, drew considerable criticism. Antoinette's grace and charms soon won over Viennese society. The same day British, Russian and French forces destroyed the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Navrino. Metternich worried that further intervention would topple the Ottoman Empire, upsetting the balance so carefully created in 1815. To his relief the new British Prime Minister Wellington and his cabinet were equally fearful of giving Russia the upper hand in the Balkans. After another round of his proposals for congresses was rejected, Metternich stood back from the Eastern question, watching as the Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed in September 1829. Though he publicly criticized it for being too harsh on Turkey, privately he was satisfied with its leniency and promise of Greek autonomy, making it a buffer against Russian expansion rather than a Russian satellite state. Metternich's private life was filled with grief. In November 1828 his mother died, and in January 1829 Antoinette died, 5 days after giving birth to their son, Richard von Metternich. After fighting tuberculosis for many months, Metternich's son Victor, then a junior diplomat, died on November 30, 1829. Consequently, he spent Christmas alone and depressed, worried by the draconian methods of some of his fellow conservatives and by the renewed march of liberalism. In May Metternich took a much-needed holiday on his estate at Johannesburg. He returned to Vienna a month later, still worried by the chaos in London and Paris, and his declining ability to prevent it. Hearing Nesselrode was due to take the waters at Carlsbad, he met him there in late July. He berated the quiet Nesselrode, but no offense was taken. The two arranged a second meeting in August. In the interim Metternich heard of France's July Revolution, which deeply shocked him and theoretically posed the need for a Congress of the Quadruple Alliance. Instead, Metternich met with Nesselrode as planned and, while the Russian rejected his plan to restore the old alliance, the pair agreed on the chiffon of Carlsbad, that panic was needless unless the new government showed territorial ambitions in Europe. Although pleased by this, Metternich's mood was soured by news of unrest in Brussels, the resignation of Wellington in London, and calls for constitutionality in Germany. He wrote with somber and almost morbid relish that it was the beginning of the end of old Europe. Nonetheless, he was heartened by the fact that the July Revolution had made a Franco-Russian alliance impossible and that the Netherlands had called an old-style congress of the sort he enjoyed so much. The 1830 convocation of the Hungarian Diet was also more successful than past ones, crowning Archduke Ferdinand as King of Hungary with little dissent. Moreover, by November his betrothal to 25-year-old Melanie Zichy Ferraris, who came from a Magyar family the Metternichs had long known, was agreed upon. The announcement caused far less consternation in Vienna than Metternich's previous bride, and they were married on January 30, 1831. In February 1831 rebels took the cities of Parma, Modena and Bologna and appealed to France for help. Their former masters appealed for help from Austria, but Metternich was anxious not to march Austrian troops into the Papal States without authorization from the new Pope Gregory XVI. He occupied Parma and Modena, however, and eventually did cross into Papal territory. As a result, Italy was pacified by the end of March. He authorized troop withdrawal from the Papal States in July, but by January 1832 they were back to put down a second rebellion. By now Metternich was aging noticeably, his hair was grey and his face drawn and sunken, although his wife still enjoyed his company. In February 1832 a daughter, also Melanie, was born. In 1833 a son, Klemens, though he died aged 2 months. In October 1834 a second son, Paul. And in 1837 his third with Melanie, Lothar. Politically, Metternich had a new adversary, Lord Palmerston, who had taken over at the British Foreign Office in 1830. By the end of 1832 they had clashed on virtually every issue. In short, Metternich wrote, "Palmerston is wrong about everything." Mostly, Metternich was annoyed by his insistence that under the 1815 agreements Britain had the right to oppose Austria's tightening of university controls in Germany, as Metternich had done again in 1832. Metternich also worried that if future congresses were held in Britain, as Palmerston wanted, his own influence would be significantly reduced. Eastern Question revisited and Peace in Europe . In 1831 Egypt invaded the Ottoman Empire. There were fears of the empire's total collapse, by which Austria stood to gain little. Metternich therefore proposed multilateral support for the Ottomans and a Viennese Congress to sort out details, but the French were evasive and the British refused to support any Congress held in Vienna. By the summer of 1833 Anglo-Austrian relations had hit a new low. with Russia. Metternich was more confident of exerting influence. He was mistaken, however, and left to observe from afar Russian intervention in the region. He still arranged to meet with the King of Prussia at Teplitz and accompany Francis to meet Tsar Nicholas at Marwan Court in TZ in September 1833. The former meeting went well. Metternich still felt able to dominate the Prussians, despite their rising economic prominence in Europe. The latter was more strained but, as Nicholas warned, 3 Marwan Court and TZ agreements were reached that shaped a new conservative league to uphold the existing order in Turkey, Poland, and elsewhere. Metternich left happy. His sole disappointment was having to commit to being tougher on Polish nationalists. Almost immediately, he heard of the creation of the Quadruple Alliance of 1834 between Britain, France, Spain and Portugal. This alliance of liberals was such an affront to Austrian values that Palmerston wrote he should like to see Metternich's face when he reads our treaty. It did indeed draw bitter condemnation, mostly because it provided occasion for an outbreak of war. Metternich tried 2 tacks, to intrigue for the removal of the British foreign and to attempt to build up cross-power bloc agreements. Palmerston was indeed removed in November, but only temporarily and not by any of Metternich's attempts. Large-scale war, however, had been avoided and the Quadruple Alliance was beginning to disintegrate. On March 2, 1835 Emperor Francis died, succeeded by his epileptic son Ferdinand I. Despite widespread opinion that Ferdinand was a ghost of a monarch, Metternich valued legitimacy highly and worked to keep the government running. He soon accompanied Ferdinand on his first meeting with Tsar Nicholas and the King of Prussia, again at Teplitz. Ferdinand was overwhelmed, especially as the delegations paraded into Prague. Overall, however, it was an untroubled meeting. The next few years passed relatively peacefully for Metternich. Diplomatic incident was limited to the occasional angry exchange with Palmerston and Metternich's failure to be a mediator between the British and Russians over their Black Sea dispute. He also put effort into bringing new technology like the railways into Austria. The most pressing issue was Hungary, where Metternich remained reluctant to support the centrist Tsar copyright Rhenish. His hesitancy is a sad commentary on his declining powers of political presence. At court Metternich increasingly lost power to the rising star Franz Anton von Kolohut-Liebstiansky, particularly in his proposals to increase military budgets. After his failed attempt in 1836 to force constitutional reform largely thwarted by the more liberally minded Archduke John Metternich was forced to share more power with Kolohut and Archduke Ludwig as part of Austria's secret state conference. Decision-making ground to a halt. Entertaining and maintaining his estates at Johannesburg, Nixwit and Plassey were consuming much of his resources at a time when he had 4 young children to support, causing him more stress. Metternich had long predicted a new crisis in the East, and when the Second Turco-Egyptian War broke out in 1839 he was anxious to re-establish Austria's diplomatic credentials. He quickly gathered representatives in Vienna, whence on July 27 they issued a communique copyright to Constantinople pledging support. However, Tsar Nicholas sent Metternich a message from St. Petersburg challenging Vienna's claim to diplomatic centrality. Metternich worked so furiously that he fell ill, spending the next 5 weeks resting at Johannesburg. The Austrians lost the initiative, and Metternich had to accept that London would be the new centre of negotiations over the Eastern question. Just 3 weeks after its creation, Metternich's European League of Great Powers had become a mere curiosity. Little, too, was heard of his proposals to hold a congress in Germany. A separate attempt to strengthen the influence of ambassadors stationed in Vienna was also rejected. This set the tone for the rest of Metternich's chancellorship. His illness had, it seemed to others, broken his love of being in office. Over the next decade his wife prepared quietly for his retirement or death in office. Metternich's work during the early 1840s was dominated again by Hungary and, more generally, questions of national identity within the diverse Austrian Empire. Here, Metternich showed moments of acute perception. His Hungarian proposals came far too late, however, as Lajos Kossuth had already led the rise of a strong Hungarian nationalism. Metternich's support for other nationalities was patchy, since he only opposed those that threatened the unity of the empire. At the Conference of State, Metternich lost his principal ally Karl Klemens in 1840, which furthered the growing paralysis at the heart of Austrian government. Metternich now struggled to enforce even the level of censorship he desired. Fortunately, there were no major challenges to the regime from outside. Italy was quiet, and neither Metternich's attempt to lecture the new Prussian King Frederick William IV nor the boredom of the new British Queen Victoria at their first meeting posed immediate problems. Far more worrying was Tsar Nicholas, whose estimation of the Habsburg dynasty and Austria was low. After an impromptu tour of Italy in 1845, the Tsar unexpectedly stopped in Vienna. Already in a bad mood, he was an awkward guest, though in between criticisms of Austria he reassured Metternich that Russia was not about to invade the Ottoman Empire again. 2 months later their countries were required to work together over the Galician slaughter and a declaration of independence from Kraków. Metternich authorized the occupation of the city and use of troops to restore order in surrounding areas, intent on undoing the pseudo-independence that had been granted Kraków in 1815. After months of negotiations with Prussia and Russia, Austria annexed the city in November 1846. Metternich regarded it as a personal victory, but it was an action of dubious utility. Not only were Polish dissidents now officially part of Austria, the Europe-wide Polish dissident movement was now worked actively against the Metternich system that had overridden the rights enshrined in 1815. Britain and France appeared similarly outraged, although calls for Metternich's resignation were ignored. For the next 2 years Ferdinand could not abdicate in favor of his son without a regency. Metternich believed Austria would need him in the interim to hold government together. Revolution. Though Metternich was tiring, memoranda kept pouring forth from his chancellery. Despite this he did not foresee the building crisis. The new Pope Pius IX was gaining a reputation as a liberal nationalist, counterbalancing Metternich and Austria. At the same time, the empire experienced unemployment and rising prices as a result of poor harvests. Metternich was bemused at the outcry from Italians, the Pope, and Palmerston when he ordered the occupation of papal-controlled Verona in the summer of 1847. Despite securing French agreement for the first time in years from Franz Section Guizot over the Swiss Civil War, France and Austria were forced into backing breakaway cantons. The pair proposed a conference, but the government crushed the revolt. It was a major blow to Metternich's prestige, and his opponents in Vienna called it evidence of his incompetence. In January 1848 Metternich predicted trouble in Italy during the year ahead. He acted on this by dispatching an envoy, Karl Ludwig von Fickelmann, to Italy. By resurrecting his 1817 plans for an Italian chancellery. And by arranging various contingency plans with the French. In late February Austrian Field Marshal Joseph Radetzky placed Austrian Italy under martial law as disturbances spread. Despite this and hearing of renewed revolution in France, Metternich was cautious, still thinking domestic revolution unlikely. He was described by a Saxon diplomat as, in the words of biographer Musulin, having shrunk to a shadow of his former self. On March 3 Kossuth gave a fiery speech in the Hungarian Diet, calling for a constitution. It was not until March 10 that Metternich appeared concerned about events in Vienna, where there were now threats and counter-threats flying. 2 petitions were organized, calling for greater freedom, transparency, and representation. Students were involved in several demonstrations, culminating on March 13 when they cheered the royal family but voiced anger at Metternich. After a customary morning, Metternich was called to meet with Archduke Ludwig soon after midday. The Chancellor had troops sent into the streets while also announcing a pre-arranged and minimal concession. In the afternoon the crowd turned hostile, and a division of troops opened fire on it, killing 5. The mob was now truly incited, as the liberals were joined by underprivileged Viennese set on wreaking havoc. The students offered to form a pro-government academic legion if their demands were met. Ludwig was eager to accept and told Metternich he must resign, to which he reluctantly agreed. After sleeping in the chancellery he was advised to either take back his resignation or leave the city. After Ludwig sent him a message to the effect that the government could not guarantee his safety, Metternich left for the house of Count Taff and then, with aid from friends Charles von Harwan-Kortagel and Johann Richberg, reached the family seat of Prince Liechtenstein 40 miles away at Felsberg. Metternich's daughter Lentine joined them on March 21 and suggested England as a haven. Agreeing, Metternich, Melanie and 19-year-old Richard set out, leaving the younger children with Lentine. Metternich's resignation had been met with cheering in Vienna, and even the Viennese commoners welcomed the end of Metternich's era of social conservatism. Exile, return, and death. After an anxious journey of 9 days during which they were variously honored and refused entry to various towns, Metternich, his wife, and son Richard arrived in the Dutch city of Arnhem. They stayed until Metternich regained his strength, then reached Amsterdam and The Hague, where they waited to hear the results of a demonstration by English Chartists, planned for April 10. On April 20 they landed at Blackwall in London, where they stayed in the Brunswick Hotel in Hanover Square for a fortnight until they found a permanent residence. Metternich largely enjoyed his time in London. The Duke of Wellington, now nearly 80, tried to keep him entertained, and there were also visits from Palmerston, Guizot and Benjamin Disraeli, who enjoyed his political conversation. The sole disappointment was that Victoria herself did not acknowledge his presence in the capital. The trio leased a house, 44 Eaton Square, for 4 months. The younger children joined them in the summer. He followed events in Austria from afar, famously denying ever having heard. In fact, he declared the turmoil in Europe to be vindication of his policies. In Vienna, a hostile post-censorship press continued to attack him. In particular, they accused him of embezzlement and accepting bribes, prompting an investigation. Metternich was eventually cleared of the more extreme charges, and searches for evidence of the lesser ones came up empty-handed. Meanwhile, as he was denied his pension, Metternich was ironically reliant on loans. In mid-September the family moved to 42 Brunswick Terrace, Brighton on the south coast of England, where tranquility of life contrasted greatly with the revolutionary Europe left behind. Parliamentary figures, particularly Disraeli, travelled down to visit them, as did Metternich's former friend Dorothea Lieven. Expecting a visit from Metternich's daughter Lentine and her own daughter Pauline, the family moved to a suite of rooms at Richmond Palace on April 23, 1849. Visitors included Wellington, who still watched out for Metternich, Johann Strauss, the composer, and Dorothea de Dino, sister of Metternich's former lover Wilhelmine of Sagan, and former lover Katharina Bagration. Metternich was showing his age, and his frequent fainting was cause for worry. The ex-chancellor was also depressed by the lack of communication from the new Emperor Franz Josef I and his government. Lentine wrote to Vienna trying to encourage this contact, and in August Metternich received a warm letter from Franz Josef. Sincere or not, it buoyed Metternich considerably. From mid-August Melanie began to push for a move to Brussels, a city cheaper to live in and closer to continental affairs. They arrived in October, staying overnight in the Hotel Bellevue. With revolution subsiding, Metternich was hopeful they would return to Vienna. Their stay in fact lasted over 18 months while Metternich waited for an opportunity to re-enter Austrian politics. It was a pleasant enough stay, first in the Boulevard de l'Observatoire and later in the Sablon filled with visits from politicians, writers, musicians and scientists. For Metternich, however, the tedium and homesickness only increased. In March 1851 Melanie induced him to write to the new political force in Vienna, Prince Schwarzenberg, to ask if he might return if he promised not to interfere in public affairs. In April he received an affirmative reply, authorized by Franz Josef. In May 1851 Metternich left for his Johannesburg estate, which he had last visited in 1845. That summer Metternich enjoyed the company of Prussian Representative Otto von Bismarck. He also enjoyed a visit from Frederick William, though the king irritated Metternich by appearing to cultivate him as a tool against Schwarzenberg. In September Metternich returned to Vienna, entertained along the way by various German princes keen to entertain the focus of Prussian intrigue. Metternich was reinvigorated, dropped his nostalgia, and lived in the present for the first time in a decade. Franz Josef asked for his advice on numerous issues, and both of the two emerging factions in Vienna courted Metternich. Even Tsar Nicholas called on him during a state visit. Metternich was not keen on the new foreign minister, Karl Ferdinand von Boll, but thought him sufficiently incompetent that he would be impressionable. Metternich's advice was of varying quality. Nonetheless, some of it was usefully insightful, even in modern issues. Now deaf, Metternich wrote endlessly, particularly for an appreciative Franz Josef. He wanted Austrian neutrality in the Crimean War, though Boll did not. In the meantime, Metternich's health was slowly failing, and he was a more peripheral figure after the death of his wife Melanie in January 1854. In a brief resurgence of energy in early 1856, he busied himself in arrangements for a marriage between his son Richard and his granddaughter Pauline, and undertook more travel. The King of the Belgians came to visit, as did Bismarck, and on August 16, 1857 he entertained the future Edward VII of the United Kingdom. Boll, however, was growing more resentful of Metternich's advice, particularly about Italy. In April 1859 Franz Josef came to ask him about what should be done in Italy. According to Pauline, Metternich begged him not to send an ultimatum to Italy, and Franz Josef explained that such an ultimatum had already been sent. In this way, much to Metternich's disappointment and to Franz Josef's embarrassment, Austria began the Second Italian War of Independence against the combined forces of Piedmont, Sardinia and her ally France. Though Metternich was able to secure the replacement of Boll with his friend Richberg, who had helped him so much in 1848, involvement in the war itself was now beyond his capacity. Even a special task given him by Franz Josef in June 1859 to draw up secret papers addressing the event of Franz Josef's death was now too taxing. Shortly afterwards Metternich died in Vienna on June 11, 1859, aged 86, and the last great figure of his generation. Almost everyone of note in Vienna came to pay tribute. In the foreign press his death went virtually unnoticed. Historical assessment. Particularly in the 19th century, Metternich was heavily criticized, decried as the man who prevented Austria and the rest of Central Europe from developing along normal liberal and constitutional lines. Had Metternich not stood in the way of progress, Austria might have reformed, dealt better with the problems of nationality, and the First World War might never have happened. Instead, Metternich chose to fight an overwhelmingly fruitless war against the forces of liberalism and nationalism. Heavy censorship was just one of a range of repressive instruments of state available to him that also included a large spy network. He opposed electoral reform, criticizing the British Reform Bill. In short, he locked himself into an embittered battle against the prevailing mood of his age. On the other hand, Metternich's diplomacy and statesmanship were the focus of praise in the 20th century from more favorable inclined historians, particularly biographer Heinrich von Srbik. For example, particularly after WWII, historians were more likely to defend Metternich's policies as reasonable attempts to achieve his goals, chiefly the balance of power in Europe. Sympathetic historians point out that Metternich correctly foresaw and worked to prevent Russian dominance in Europe, succeeding where his successors would fail 130 years later. As argued by Srbik, Metternich himself pursued legality, cooperation, and dialogue, and therefore helped ensure 30 years of peace, the age of Metternich. Authors like Peter Viereck and Ernst B. Haas also give Metternich credit for his more liberal ideals, even if they weighed relatively little in his overall policies. Critical views presuppose Metternich had the ability to shape Europe favorably but chose not to. More modern critiques like that of A.J.P. Taylor have questioned how much influence Metternich actually wielded. Robin Oakey, a critic of Metternich, noted that even in the realm of foreign affairs Metternich had only his own persuasiveness to rely on, and this degraded over time. By this interpretation, his task was to create a smokescreen that hid Austria's true weakness. When it came to choosing a set of sound principles, wrote Taylor, most men could do better while shaving. The result was that Metternich was no captivating diplomat. Taylor described him as the most boring man in European history. Not only were his failures limited to foreign affairs, critics argue, at home he was equally powerless, failing to effect even his own proposals for administrative reform. In contrast, those who have attempted to rehabilitate Metternich describe him as unquestionably a master of diplomacy, someone who perfected and indeed shaped the nature of diplomacy in his era. In a similar vein, Alan Sked argues that Metternich's smokescreen may well have served a purpose in furthering a relatively coherent set of principles. Issue: Metternich's children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren are. Ancestry. See also: Age of Metternich, Princess Pauline von Metternich, Metternich-Staler. Notes. References. Bibliography. This article incorporates text from a publication now in the public domain. Chisholm, Hugh, ed. Metternich Winberg, Klemens Wenzel von. Encyclopædia Britannica. Cambridge University Press. Berthier de Sauvigny, Guillaume de. Metternich and His Times. Ride, Peter. London, Darton, Longman and Todd. Cecil, Algernon. Metternich. London, Eyre and Spottiswoode. Ford, Franklin L. Europe, 1780–1830. Hong Kong, Longman. ISBN 978-0-582-48346-0. Jarrett, Mark. The Congress of Vienna and Its Legacy, War and Great Power Diplomacy After Napoleon. London, I.B. Tauris and Company, Limited. ISBN 978-1780761,169. Kissinger, Henry. A World Restored, Metternich, Castlereagh and the Problems of the Peace, 1812–1822. London, Weidenfeld and Nicholson. ISBN 978-0-297-64395-1. Moussulin, Stella. Vienna in the Age of Metternich. London, Faber and Faber. ISBN 0-571-09858-4. Oakey, Robin. The Habsburg Monarchy, c. 1765–1918. Macmillan. ISBN 978-0-333-39654-4. Palmer, Alon. Metternich, Chancellor of Europe. London, Orion. ISBN 978-85799-868-9. Sked, Alon. Metternich and Austria, An Evaluation. Basingstoke, England, Palgrave Macmillan. ISBN 978-1-4039-9114-0. Sked, Alon. Metternich. History Today 33. Hamilton Williams, David. Waterloo New Perspectives, The Great Battle Reappraised. Wiley. ISBN 0-471-05225-6. Klemens Wenzel, Prince Metternich. Royal Collection 2013. Retrieved September 22, 2013. Zamoyski, Adam. Rights of Peace, The Fall of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna. ISBN 0-00-712375-2. May, Arthur J. The Age of Metternich 1814–1848. Holt, Reinhardt and Winston, Incorporated. External links: Metternich's Political Profession of Faith, Metternich on Censorship, Castle Kinner 3/4 Vart in Western Bohemia. Metternich's residence with collections, now open to the public.